Thunder!
Sorry to keep you waiting.
Hey everybody, how's it going? Kid Icarus Uprising, my favorite 3DS game and one of my favorite games of all time. This game is everything that I look for in a Nintendo game. The gameplay, the writing, the characters, the world building, everything came together so perfectly for this game. And yet Nintendo hasn't done anything with the series for over 10 years now since Uprising, which is crazy because Uprising was already a revitalization of the Kid Icarus franchise. See, if you didn't know, the original Kid Icarus came out in the 80s, then we got a sequel on the Game Boy in 91, and then there was nothing for Kid Icarus until Pitch showed up again in his new design in Brawl, and then we finally got a reboot helmed by Sakurai, who brought him back in the first place on the 3DS, and the game was absolutely incredible. And then they did nothing with the franchise after that, which is so wild to me because Uprising feels like a masterclass in what a reboot of a video game series should be. So to me, it feels borderline criminal that Nintendo would take a game with so much potential, so much love from its fans, and just shelve it. No. That needs to change. So I put together some ideas for how Nintendo could revive this series yet again, and hopefully in a way that the series will actually stick around this time. So first things first, we gotta talk about a remake, because yes, while this game is loved by so many fans, and you could probably make a sequel no problem and it would get support, I think this game deserves a remake, because right now, Uprising is trapped on the 3DS. It never got an HD re-release, and while the gameplay for Uprising is really good in my opinion, and I wouldn't really change a thing in terms of the gameplay itself, the console that gameplay was played on didn't exactly benefit the game. Let me explain what I mean. So Kid Icarus Uprising was an on-rails shooter and hack and slash hybrid, and it felt like it was a game that was meant to be controlled with two sticks. Well, if you haven't noticed, the 3DS doesn't exactly have two sticks, so you would be controlling Pit with the circle pad, and then pretty much everything else, camera, aiming, shooting, would be done with the touchscreen and a very limited amount of face buttons. That just felt wrong. I mean, the gameplay, it worked, and I don't think that the game was unplayable by any means, but it was just a janky experience that felt like it deserved more. And what's funny is, even when the 3DS had the option for a second stick with the Circle Pad Pro and then the actual little C-stick nub that they add to the new 3DS line, it wasn't utilized in Uprising. So this game definitely deserves a port to the Switch, or whatever the Switch's successor is at this point. So from this point, the changes that I would make are more just quality of life changes more than anything. So with the gameplay and the addition of the right stick, I think that you would be able to fully aim with the right stick, but I think the game would also be able to utilize the Switch's gyro capabilities to aim a little bit more precisely, kind of like how you do in Splatoon. I think the ability to fully remap controls would be nice, a dedicated dodge roll button this time around, maybe the ability to still use the touchscreen in handheld mode to sort of recreate the experience of what it was on the 3DS. Because like I said before, the gameplay itself, there's really nothing wrong with it, but it would be nice for the game to get these minor quality of life changes that it can benefit from being on a new HD console. And that's really all I have to say for the main single player game for a remake. Now we gotta talk about the multiplayer, because that's the part that I think is gonna get overhauled the most. Once again, this is another mode where I think that the gameplay is fine, but there are just certain things here and there that you could add to the game now that would make it just an overall better experience. The most notable one is better online. Now, I know that Nintendo Switch's online isn't exactly impressive by any means, but I still think that it would lend itself to allowing for a better multiplayer experience than what we had on the 3DS with the game. Another notable thing that I would change with the multiplayer is changing how abilities and weapons work, because in the original mode, you were able to bring in abilities that you had from single player, and I think that allowed for a bit of an unfair advantage in the multiplayer mode. So I think that all abilities, all weapons should just be available for anyone to use in the multiplayer, just so you got sort of an even playing field. And then another thing that I would add to this mode is more maps, because if they are intending for this multiplayer mode to come back in the remake, I think that more maps would definitely increase the replayability, the longevity of this mode, and I think that if you added a lot more to this, it could become a really fun addition to Nintendo's online offerings. Alright, so now that I've covered the possibility of a Kid Icarus Uprising remake, I want to talk about a sequel, because this is what we've all been waiting for. This is what fans of the first game really want. So I've sort of gone ahead and come up with an in-depth idea for a sequel. So let's get started. Let's start with the story. First off, the title of this new game is going to be called Kid Icarus Salvation. Basically, I had the idea that some strong warrior, maybe human, maybe someone from the gods' past, has resurfaced and is tired of the gods and deities meddling with mortal affairs. And so, this being would go ahead and imprison the gods in their own realms, creating havoc and chaos throughout the world due to the fact that the gods aren't present anymore. This includes characters like Palutena, Viridi, Medusa, etc. And so Pit has to go on a mission to rescue all of the gods. But because Palutena isn't present, Pit is going to have to form some uneasy alliances along the way with gods that he might rescue before Palutena. I thought of the idea similar to how Viridi granted Pit his power of flight. Maybe this time around, Pit saves Medusa first, and she grants him power of flight. And this actually goes along with what the whole gimmick of this game would be this time around, because I thought that there should be some fun and interesting hook this time. So because Pit is going around and saving all of the gods, I could see each one granting Pit a brand new ability or blessing, sort of like the boons in Hades, where the gods would grant Zagreus different abilities that he could use in combat. However, I think in Kid Icarus Salvation, these abilities would be permanent and allow Pit to take on newer, stronger foes as the game goes on, and just give you a lot more to work with in terms of Pit's abilities. Now, you would still have all of your normal weapons that you had in Uprising and be able to fuse weapons and whatnot, but these would be just additional abilities like increased defense, increased strength, maybe you summon a god to help you in battle, just minor things, but they would just add a lot more variety to the gameplay. And speaking of gameplay, we gotta talk about how the core gameplay is gonna get switched up in this sequel. So I think for the most part, things are gonna stay largely the same, with it being broken up between aerial segments and ground segments, but how they're handled I think is going to be a bit different. So at first I thought aerial would still be on rails, but I think that they should change it up a little bit. I still think that you would have sort of that on rails type combat when you're locked onto enemies, but when you're not directly in combat, I think that it would be really interesting to allow you to freely fly around in the sky. Think something similar to like how the loft wings work in Zelda Skyward Sword. I just think that with the addition of a proper right stick and gyro controls, there's a lot more that you could add to make this feel a little bit different than Uprising while still keeping the core gameplay the same. As for the ground missions, I think that they would stay the same, but with the addition of the better camera controls, a dedicated dodge button, just minor stuff, but I think that overall I would keep the ground segments largely unchanged. Now, I do have one more thing to add to this, and it would definitely be different because in Uprising, you had the aerial segments and then you had the ground segments, and they were pretty separated from each other, where you would do your aerial section, you would land, and then it would go into the ground section of the chapter. But what if for some chapters in Kid Icarus Salvation, you had sections where it wasn't so separated and the ground and aerial segments were more intertwined? Let me give an example. Say that you're on a mission and you're doing the aerial segment, you're flying around fighting enemies, but then you see a landmass floating in the sky. I think it would be really cool if you could go over to that landmass, land, and then seamlessly transition into ground combat. It would be something very interesting, very different from what Uprising did, but that sort of mix-up in gameplay variety is something that I would love to see in an evolution of Uprising's formula. And that about does it for the core gameplay. Now that I've talked about that, I can move into talking about some of the other additions that I would love to see in the sequel. The first of which is a second playable character, and it's not Dark Pit. So I was thinking, with the whole story being that the gods are imprisoned, you wouldn't have the gods, specifically Palutena, watching over the mortal realm, and Pit would mostly be having to deal with the realm of the gods, freeing all of them. The mortal realm would be largely unattended to. So I thought, why don't we flesh out that one part from Kid Icarus Uprising where he was playable and make Magnus a full-on second playable protagonist in the game. So Magnus would be limited to basically just ground missions because he can't fly, he can't do the aerial missions like Pit, but I think that his ground missions would be a lot more intense, a lot more action-oriented than what Pit would have. Because I do think in terms of raw, pure physical strength, Magnus is stronger than Pit. So having him take on bigger bosses, hordes of enemies, almost making it more of like a character action style game for his segments, I think that would be really cool to see. Having Pit basically deal with all the gods and divine stuff while Magnus handles the realm of the mortals would allow for a really nice dual narrative that would allow for the same story to be told from drastically different perspectives. And with there being 2 characters in the sequel now, there is something else that I wanted to add, and it has to do with side quests. So I thought that the main story, it would play out where you play a mission as Pit, then you play a mission as Magnus, maybe you play a few more chapters as Pit. You switch off in more of a linear sense, but I think that if you include side quests, you could have side quests for Pit or side quests for Magnus that you could really do at any time. I think that the addition of side quests would also make a lot of sense narratively too, because you'd have Pit doing maybe favors for the gods where he could get better loot or maybe upgrade the abilities that he's gotten from them. And then on Magnus's side, since Palutena is out of the picture, there would be unanswered prayers for mortals, and maybe Magnus could sort of take on these unanswered prayers as mercenary work and answer them in his own sort of way. And that pretty much does it for my ideas on the single player mode for a sequel. I think that adding all these different little gameplay changes here and there, adding a second playable character, it would just really flesh out what we already had with Kid Icarus Uprising and just really explore this series' potential and do more with it. Because like I said earlier, I think that Kid Icarus Uprising had everything that I wanted in a Nintendo game. And for that reason, I think that if Nintendo plays their cards right, they have the potential to really put Kid Icarus up on the same pedestal as some of their other big franchises. And that's something that I would really love to see. Now, before I wrap up here, there is still one more big aspect that I want to talk about with the sequel. So I covered the single player, but I would love to see a new fleshed out version of Kid Icarus Uprising's multiplayer. Now, for Kid Icarus Salvation's multiplayer, I'd like to do something similar to this, but I think rather than having generic grunts to choose from as your playable characters for multiplayer, I think it would be way more fun to play as actual characters from the story. So Pit, Dark Pit, Magnus, Veridi, Palutena, Phosphora, Pandora. Like, there's so many characters that you could play as in the multiplayer, and I think it would add way more variety to the gameplay. I think you could still have it where every character can use the same weapon pool, but each individual character would have their own unique special moves, different abilities that would give them advantages and disadvantages over other characters. I think that would just be really fun and allow players to really play as the characters that they love from the main game. I think that also by having this wide array of characters and also potentially adding additional characters to the roster down the line could make the multiplayer feel more appealing. I could even see Nintendo including this as like a standalone game that's included in Nintendo Switch Online to really promote the service, to get people playing online with this game mode more, and just to bring the Kid Icarus IP to a much wider audience. Because they could easily do something where if you have NSO, you can play this mode for no additional cost, and maybe people who didn't already have the sequel would be like, hey, I want to experience more of these characters, more of this world, this series, and then they go out and they buy the actual full-on game. And that about does it for my ideas on how Kid Icarus could come back. This series has so much potential and so much charm, and I would hate to see Nintendo completely abandon it. It deserves a second chance at the very least, and I think that if you gave it the second chance that it deserves on a console like the Switch, I'm sure that it would perform insanely well because these characters, this world, they're so appealing, and I'm sure that if players got to experience this game, they would understand why Uprising has the cult following that it does. Oh, and one more thing. Because Nintendo has been getting more into entertainment, if they're bringing back the games, bringing back the Kid Icarus IP, give us a full anime. I know they dabbled with the shorts on the 3DS's video service or whatever it was, but a full-blown anime from Kid Icarus. It just feels perfect for it. Just give me a full Kid Icarus series, Nintendo. Anyways, those are just my thoughts, but I would absolutely love to see what you guys think. Do you want to see Kid Icarus return? Do you want a sequel, an anime, just a remake, whatever? But leave your thoughts down in the comments below. But for now, I think that is enough out of me. So if you guys like this video, feel free to like and subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Later.